In the 1st century BC, the island, which at that time was unknown as it was called, was inhabited by numerous Celtic tribes. The warriors of these tribes applied war paint to their bodies before the battle, so the Romans, who were never interested in the self-names of the barbarian tribes, decided to call them Picts, from the Latin word pictus, which means painted. For centuries, the Picts lived their lives trading and fighting with each other, until Julius Caesar turned his attention to the island. In 55 BC, Roman legionnaires under the command of Julius Caesar landed on the island and began the process of conquering the local Celtic tribes. The Romans did not manage to establish their authority over the entire island, since its northern part was distinguished by impenetrable terrain, excellent for defense, and at the same time was rather poor. So that the Picts living in the northern part of the island could not raid the territory controlled by Rome. In 128, Hadrian's Wall was built, which divided the island into two parts, Roman and barbarian. A Roman province was formed on the island, which was called Britannia, and the Romans began to call the Picts who were under the rule of Rome the Britons. During the reign of Emperor Antoninus, the Romans managed to push the Picts further north, and in 154 the Antonine Wall was built to protect the conquered territories. Under the rule of the Roman Empire, a significant part of the local population was Romanized and converted to Christianity. The construction of cities and roads began, and all spheres of life began to be regulated by Roman laws. At the end of the 2nd century, the Picts, forced into the barren parts of the island, suffering from hunger, increased pressure on Roman Britain. At the same time, the Irish Scots, who were related to the Picts by the Celtic tribes, began to raid the coast of Roman Britain. In this situation, the Romans had to leave the Antonine Wall, after which the Hadrian's Wall again became the border between the barbarian and the Roman world. In 367, the Picts and Scots, who began to move to the British island, managed to break through the defenses of the Hadrian's Wall and get to the outskirts of Londinium, plundering and destroying everything in their path. The Romans under the command of Theodosius managed, having gathered their strength, not only to stop the invasion of the barbarians, but also to push them out of Hadrian's Wall. However, the Picts and Scots did not plan to surrender. Instead of trying to break through Hadrian's Wall, they surrendered to bypass it by sea and plunder the western coast of Roman Britain. The problems of the Romans did not end there. A new threat has emerged in the form of the German Saxons. The warriors of the Saxons were skilled seafarers, which allowed them to effectively engage in piracy and plunder the coast of Roman Britain. So that the local population did not suffer from the Saxon raids, the Romans had to build a network of forts, which was called the Saxon Shore. By the beginning of the 5th century, Roman Britain's defense expenditures began to outstrip the province's income. The funding of the Roman legions on the island has decreased significantly, so the legionnaires proclaimed one of their leaders Emperor Constantine III and crossed the English Channel and set off to capture Rome. A small number of legionnaires remained on the island, which was clearly not enough to provide reliable protection against the Picts, Scots and Saxons. In the end, Constantine III failed, and the inhabitants of Roman Britain asked the Emperor Honorius to return the legions to the island in order to protect the province from the barbarians. Honorius never sent new legions to the island, but instead issued a decree in 410 allowing the Britons to bear arms and form troops in self-defense. Thus, Britain found itself without the protection of the Roman Empire, and almost all the remaining legionnaires left it. Together with the Roman legions, a significant part of the Romanized Britons left the island. The Britons moved to Roman-controlled territory on the Armorica Peninsula. They began to call their new homeland Britain. This name eventually transformed into Brittany, familiar to us. Meanwhile, despite all the attempts of the local administration to maintain centralized power, anarchy began on the island. Roman Britain was divided into a huge number of small states and a bloody struggle for power began. The most successful ruler of the Britons was Vortigern, who initially owned lands in Cornwall and Devonshire. He managed to raise a large army and defeat his competitors to establish control over most of the former Roman province of Britannia. Having destroyed his competitors, Vortigern faced a huge problem in the form of tribes of Scots and Picts, who pressed his troops from the north. Realizing that the available forces are clearly not enough to stop the invasion of the Picts and Scots, he called for help from mercenaries from the tribes of the Saxons, Jutes and Angles, who lived on the northern coast of Europe. The arrival of highly experienced mercenaries tipped the scales in Vortigern's favor. The Picts and Scots were defeated and driven to the north of the island. It would seem that the situation was as favorable as possible for Vortigern, but in the early 40s of the 5th century, the mercenaries rose in revolt and, having occupied almost the entire east coast of the island, began to raid the central part of Britain. The Britons tried to resist, but the situation was not in their favor. The fact is that the local population of Roman Britain was used to relying on the protection of the Roman legions and did not have combat experience. At the same time, the Angles, Saxons and Jutes had vast combat experience, which allowed them to win victories even over the numerically superior army of the Britons. After the death of Vortigern, the united army of the Britons was led by Ambrosius Aurelianus, who, having concluded an alliance with the Scottish tribes, was able to focus on the fight against the Germans. He was able to muster a formidable Briton army, as well as win over the Britons, who served as auxiliary cavalry in the Roman legions. The infantry of the Britons, of course, could not be compared in battle with the Germans, so Ambrosius Aurelianus decided to rely on the cavalry, which the Angles, Saxons and Jutes practically did not have. Around the year 500, the Angles, Saxons and Jutes organized a new campaign to finally subdue the Britons. Ambrosius Aurelianus was ready for this and managed to place his army in the path of the enemy. The battle took place near Badon Hill. Unfortunately, there are no exact data on the number of enemy armies. The Britons took refuge in the forest and began to wait for the enemy troops. At this time, the combined army of the Angles, Saxons and Jutes, unaware of the ambush, was moving deep into the territory of the Britons. When the Germans reached the surrounding forest, in which the Britons were hiding, a hail of arrows fell upon them. Caught in a massive shelling, the Anglo-Saxons tried to form a battle formation in order to protect themselves from arrows and go on a counterattack. At this point they were attacked by the Briton cavalry. The horsemen swiftly attacked the enemy infantry, preventing them from closing their shields and forming a battle formation. The Anglo-Saxons suffered losses, but did not plan to surrender. Realizing that the situation was not in their favor, the leader of the Anglo-Saxons ordered his people to begin a retreat to a nearby hill. Repulsing the attacks of the Briton cavalry, the Anglo-Saxons managed to get to the top of the hill and take up defense. Since the cavalry could not effectively attack up the hillside, despite numerous attempts, the British did not manage to break through the Anglo-Saxon defenses. With the onset of darkness, the battle ceased. The Britons set up camp near the hill on which the Anglo-Saxon army was located and began to prepare for a new attack. On the morning of the next day, the Britons, having formed battle formations, advanced towards the enemy. A hail of arrows again fell upon the Anglo-Saxons, which did not allow them to maneuver. When the Briton infantry reached the enemy position on the hill, a bloody hand-to-hand match ensued. Despite the numerical superiority of the enemy, the Anglo-Saxons defended effectively. Realizing that the Briton infantry would not be able to defeat the enemy in hand-to-hand combat, Ambrosius Aurelianus, at the head of his entire cavalry, swiftly attacked the flank of the Anglo-Saxon army. Under the onslaught of the Briton cavalry, the Anglo-Saxons faltered and began to flee. The defeat at the Battle of Badon Hill temporarily stopped the expansion of the Anglo-Saxons. In turn, the Britons, even having won a victory, were not able to oust the Anglo-Saxons from the island. It should be mentioned that, according to most historians, it was Ambrosius Aurelianus who became the prototype of the legendary King Arthur. There was a temporary lull during this time. A large number of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes arrived on the island, who began to form their own kingdoms. By the second half of the 6th century, the Jutes formed their own kingdom in Britain, Kent. The tribes of the Saxons formed the kingdoms of Wessex, Sussex, and Essex. and the more numerous Angles formed the kingdoms of East Anglia, Middle Anglia, Mercia, Bernicia, Deorham and Lindsey. In 577, King Celan of Wessex, having gathered an impressive army, invaded the territory of the Britons. Near the village of Deorham, the army of the Saxons clashed with the combined army of the three kingdoms of the Britons. Since the Saxons were more experienced fighters, they inflicted a crushing defeat on the Britons. In this battle, 3 kings of the Britons died, and their kingdoms were included in Wessex. Having suffered a defeat, the Britons, living in Cornwall Peninsula, lost contact with their relatives who lived in other parts of Britain. In 613, the king of Bernicia, Ethelfrith, together with the king of Mercia, Cyril, gathered a large army and invaded the territories controlled by the Britons. The Angles faced the combined army of the Briton kings at the Battle of Chester. In the ensuing battle, the Angles succeeded in defeating the Briton army and killing most of the Briton kings in battle. After a crushing defeat at the Battle of Chester, only hard-to-reach areas of Wales and Cornwall remained under control of Britons. Since the lands in these regions were not fertile, the Anglo-Saxons did not make serious attempts to capture them. Instead, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms started fighting each other for control of the most fertile lands. After some time, only 7 of the 10 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms remained. The fact is that the kingdom of Bernicia was able to absorb the kingdom of Deorham and Lindsey, as a result of which a new kingdom was formed, Northumbria. In turn, the kingdom of Mercia was able to conquer Middle Anglia. A time of relative peace came on the island. The 7 kingdoms controlled most of the island, the Britons controlled Cornwall and Wales, and the northern part of Britain remained under the control of the Picts and Scots. This delicate balance was upset by the landing of the great Viking army on the island, which forever changed the face of Britain. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel and click on the bell.